Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today, at long last, I am going to paint a white horse, and importantly, this one comes courtesy of the Price of Crowns, which is a Württemberg 3D printable army available from Piano Wargames. Now at the moment, they're also doing the Price of Crowns 2 via Kickstarter for the artillery and horses, which is pretty rad. They are fantastic. This fella here being from the original, gives you some idea of what to expect. Now this fella is also available in white metal, so if you don't have a 3D printer, don't feel as though you're going to miss out. I'm going to go over a couple of different techniques today, and I had a great time painting him. It's rare that I spend a little bit of extra time just doing something because I'm enjoying it. So this one has been a good 2 or 3 years in the making, White Cavalry. So hopefully there is something here that you will find interesting. All of the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. And when it comes to priming this fella, because I want a very bright uniform and horse, I've primed him with Seer. Now I have glued the rider to the horse before worrying about what I'm going to do with him. I knew that he was going to have quite a bright uniform, so priming them together is really no deal. If you do have a darker uniform, something that you want to prime from a grey or even a black, then what you can do is just mount the rider on something different and paint them separately. But in this case, painting them together is going to work just fine. Now over to the side here, I've got one of my little pellets from the stationery aisle. These things cost €1 over here, extremely cheap, but the well is what we're going to find useful. I've mixed up 3 parts contrast medium to 1 part Basilicanum grey, because we want quite a faded finish here. Now you could paint straight Basilicanum grey onto the horse, but you're going to get quite a dark finish then. What I want is to introduce just a little bit of shading, and you can go up over the reins and what have you with this, because we are going to paint those in a solid colour later. The only areas that you really want to avoid are trousers and the equipment on the horse. One of the cool things I like about thinning these things down with the medium is that it gives you plenty of time to work with them. So if you are worried about it drying out while you're painting it on, don't be. This works rather well this way. It's important that you let that dry thoroughly, but you'll then have a nice, very pale grey. It works quite well. I think that looks fairly natural. If you wanted to paint instead, say, a dun horse, something with a little bit of beige, then you could use instead Skeleton Horde thinned out to the same degree, and that would give you a similar sort of saturation, but that beige which would be more appropriate. What we'll do now is go on back to our primer colours. So I have some Seer here from the pot, and this is where I mentioned Brian the Disco Theory horse. I will not explain, I'm not going to explain Brian any further except to link to that in the description. He's an absolutely wonderful teaching tool from Nick Baton over at the Warhammer community team. I thoroughly recommend, if you are into painting horses or if you've got a lot of them to paint, have a look at Brian. There is a lot of wonderful information there. So we're going to paint our Seer back over the Basilicanum grey, leaving that shaded grey in the recesses. In some areas, I'm probably going to want a slightly thinner brush. But yeah, at this point, you could also quite happily have gotten yourself a dry brush and very lightly dry brush white over the whole horse. It'll be much quicker, will look a little bit rougher, but honestly, for your bulk, well, if you're painting a white horse, you're probably not painting bulk horses for your cavalry, but dry brushing them will give you a pretty decent result very quickly. But what I'll do now is go around all of the horse, and I'm going to pick out the high points of his musculature with the Seer again. Now that will take a little bit of doing. I know ordinarily I suggest the quick method, and I think, quite genuinely, I might have gotten a smoother finish in some areas by simply dry brushing. And in that case, you could use Praxity White quite happily. But a slightly slower, smoother finish there. I did need to apply 2 coats, even 3 in some of the large flatter areas like his butt here. But once you've finished, you can then move on to a final highlight for the horse. Now white's a funny color because in reality, it's actually quite difficult to get a pure white. And particularly on our tabletop, if you just paint something flat white and then shade it, you haven't got a huge amount that you can do to it to make it pop a little on the table. So what I've got now, this is some off-white from Vallejo, but you could just as easily use white scar or anything of the sort. And I'm going to use just a tiny wee bit of this to highlight some of the areas where I want that really sharp white line. So you'll see now I'm concentrating, I'm whispering. It's very important so you don't scare the paint away. And if you're struggling for areas to highlight like this, check out Brian the Disco Horse. Now this is a method which doesn't photograph particularly well, unfortunately, but once that's on the table, that will look ace. It's not terribly taxing, but to be perfectly honest, I think you could probably Apothecary white and then dry brush white the whole figure. I've gone back and I have tidied up the hair a little with some grey Seer, just a bit of that over the top. What I've got now is one of my makeup brushes and some Wrack White. Now ordinarily I would say the difference between Wrack White and Praxetti White is minimal. I mean, you could even dry brush the hair here with ordinary white paint, it won't matter. But just a little bit of this to add a little more contrast there. By which I mean visual contrast, not the contrast product. Now ordinarily I would paint the whole horse, so the hair would be painted in the mane rather, in the same color as the horse, but I wanted to show you dry brushing as a method for the white. As well, I'm going to use here Nuln Oil and Lahmian Medium in the same way that I did the Basilicanum Grey, so half and half. And what we'll do is we're going to paint this over the hair that we've already done. Not very much, you don't need to go crazy with this. Then once your Nuln Oil is dry, you'll have something that looks like this. Now I would suggest pick one style or the other for your own horses. Don't use them both on the same horse as I have here, because it won't quite mesh. I've done this purely so that you can see how both of them will look. What we'll do is move on to the leather areas, and for this I'm going to use German Grey. Now we're going to also paint in the parts on the officer that will be black too, so let's go ahead and start applying this carefully around the leather stuff. I tend to find that once the black is done, so much of the miniature comes together. He starts looking really finished. Now, as well, when it comes to these white buttons on his chest, I have dotted them in black now, because I want a little bit of shading on those later. And if we black them in now, then you can dot in and clean up with some grey Seer if you need to, which I have already done. So from now on, it's really as much as painting any other miniature. So I'm going to start by painting his skin, and we will paint outwards. So I'm starting here with beige red rather. This is a Vallejo color. But as I point out all the time, painting skin is up to you, which colors you think are going to work well. Now we can start applying some other colors, and for this we're going to use largely contrast. Now this color I'm using, Iyanden yellow, this one, it depends on which regiment this guy belonged to, so a little bit of research, you can just swap this color out for what you need. I'm going to apply this fairly carefully to his chest, but you'll see here the benefit in having blacked in those buttons first, as I can just pop straight over the top of them, and it will not matter. If you've ever asked me how to paint Austrian uniforms, this is pretty much it. We're going to paint in his jacket now, and any of the other blue details. There are quite a few blues in the contrast range, but I'm going to use Leviadon blue for this. In my opinion, it's the one that looks the best over the Grey Seer primer. Let's just get that in shot. Now, if you make any mistakes and you go over areas that you're going to want to have white later, we can tidy that up with a little bit of Grey Seer from the pot. Now, Leviadon blue is an extremely strong pigment, so if there is another candidate for thinning with a little bit of the contrast medium, Leviadon blue is going to be it. We are going to highlight this in a little bit, so I'm not too worried that it's not a perfect color, but it is a really good base coat. Speaking of, I have here Apothecary White, and we're going to apply this, well, I'll give you a guess, all over the white areas. You can be fairly generous with this. And oops, I probably should have fixed that with a little bit of grace here first. But anyway, let's go around now. All of the white details. Just add on a little bit of this bluish tint for us to highlight later. Now for any gold frogging and the strap on his helmet, we're going to use Nazdreg yellow. Now this will look absolutely dreadful going on, so trust me on this. Remember that we aren't doing one thick coat. We are using these as base coats, which we will then tidy up and highlight. So when it looks like a vaguely brown mess, don't worry, that just means you're doing it right. Now the last of the contrast colors we're going to apply, this is Cygor brown. And it's a lovely dark brown, got a little bit of a red tint to it, so it's ideal for leather. So let's get in behind here. Now the same as with Leviadon blue, this is one where you're going to find it's an extremely strong pigment, so take your time. Now while that dries, I want to reflect on the incredible hubris that suggested I paint this dude in one piece. I really should have painted him in two separate pieces and assembled him later, but oh well, there are just a couple of areas that I simply cannot reach with the brush, but I'm not going to show you where they are. And if you can't see them, fine, surely. I have some Iron Hand steel here, and I want to start from quite a bright metal color because I want bright, shiny metal. And, well, let's paint the metal bits. And then for any gold or brass bits, we're going to use Retributor armor. Now with those base coats finished, it's time to do any last tidy up that you need to, and I have gone back with a little bit of my German grey just to fix up some of those little mistakes. We're now going to use 3 shades, which is a little uncommon for me, but I do want this guy to look nice. So we're going to start off by using Reikland Fleshshade on his skin and the gold on his sword up here, which is quite handy since it's right next to the skin after all. Now for most of the black leather stuff and any silver parts, we'll use some Nuln Oil. And then finally, for the little doofer on the front of his saddle here, this soft bit, and his helmet, we're going to apply Agrax Earthshade. Now, once at last those are dry, it's time to do some highlights. And you'll probably see I've snuck ahead a little bit and tested out one of my colors. Not quite what I wanted though, so we are going to go back with some of that beige red and paint over most of the skin again in order to lighten that up a little, but without being quite so red. Then after painting in most of the skin with that base color again, I have here some flat flesh from Vallejo, and I'm going to pick out just a few higher details like his cheekbones, tip of his nose, and along his chin. And I'll do the back of his knuckles too. Once you're satisfied with your face, it's time to go back to our off-white, or pure white, whichever white you want to use, and we're going to start dotting in some of these highlights on the white. Now we're getting somewhere. And when it comes to highlighting his belt, or this waistband he's wearing, I found holding him sideways and little short flicky motions was the easiest way to get that. Don't worry too much about it being perfectly accurate to the shape of the waistband. It's not going to matter. And when it comes to highlighting the black, we're going to do this in 2 ways. Now first off, for the black leather, like his boots and the reins and what have you, I have here Dark Reaper, and this is going to give us a blue-black sort of tint to the edge of some of these details. Now again, that's one of those things which doesn't show up terribly well on camera, but which looks pretty cool in reality, so unfortunately you're just going to have to trust me there. We'll move on, and we're going to do the same thing to the fluffy stuff, as it were, anything which we need to highlight which isn't a straight leather. And for this, I've got Stormvermin Fur. I don't want very much of this on my brush because I'm going to try and essentially just little flicky bits of this along the extreme edges of some of the floof here. Now the same goes for his helmet, just a few little speckly dots to give the impression of highlighting there, but you don't have to painstakingly do every part. With some Liberator gold, we're going to highlight the, well, I'll let you guess. And same as with the leather and the little fluffy bits we've painted so far, you can be a little impressionist with this, and that will work fine. And when it comes to highlighting the blue, we're going to use a Latok blue. Now this one's quite nice. It's a really rich blue, nice medium blue too. If you haven't got this, then McCrag blue would be a pretty good second place. There we go. And we're just going to add a little bit of this on the creases and folds and the corners of any blue details. Now, particularly when it comes to light yellow, try not to highlight yellow with yellow. It will look a little washed out. So instead, turn to something like a bone color. And for this, we're using Ushabti bone. So just a tiny wee bit of this along the edges and corners of any folds. And if you want a really pronounced highlight, a little bit of Screaming Skull might be where you go to instead. Now, one thing I realized I'd forgotten was a little bit of black to fill in the eyes. And I've also done a little bit of Basilicanum grey just on the hooves. Of course, for different breeds, these will be different colors. If you know better than me, then pick the color that looks most accurate and go for it. What I'm going to do now, there is one last detail, and it's really tiny, so I'm not going to do it on camera. If we look up here, this fella's got a tiny wee bit of hair poking in the side there. And for that, I'm going to use Dryad Bark and then a little bit of Baneblade Brown to finish that off. And that is finally the last finishing touches done. So what I need to do is go ahead and hit this guy with a matte varnish spray. I am going to use Vallejo's matte like I normally do, and then go ahead and pop a base on him. Let's get a look at what this fella looks like when he is finally finished. So there at last, both our officer and the nice white horse he rode in on are complete. Now there are a ton of ways that you could improve on this or make it simpler. And part of the reason why I wanted to show you those two separate ways of doing white on a horse is that there's a dozen ways of doing them. You could even start from a grey primer and layer up, not actually use a shade at all. It's really up to you. And I do thoroughly recommend, cruise along, check out Brian the Disco Theory horse at the link in the description. It is massively helpful. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support lets me do stuff like this. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comments box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.